It started on a Tuesday. Seattle was still half asleep outside, fog curling around apartment windows like the city was trying to keep a secret. Jake stood in the kitchen, barefoot on cold tile, making coffee like he always did. 2 mugs, one for him, one for Talia. Almond milk in hers. No sugar. She said sweetness should come from life, not from additives. He stirred her cup absent-mindedly, his mind drifting toward the client deadline he'd been dodging. That's when he noticed her standing by the doorway, hair tied up, sweater slipping off one shoulder, eyes unreadable. She gave him a soft, almost apologetic smile. And then, without a word, she turned and walked away. No good morning. No kiss on the cheek. Just silence, like a note left in a hotel room after checkout. Jake stared at her half-empty mug. The silence wasn't loud. It was surgical. He thought. It's starting again. Another storm. It had become a pattern, a rhythm. Her love came in cycles. High tide, low tide, vanish. One week she was folding his laundry and humming sod like they were 30 years deep into a happy marriage. The next, she'd go radio silent while sitting 3 feet away from him on the same couch, scrolling through her phone like he was a ghost. A ghost paying for Wi-Fi. Jake used to joke about it. You're like a cat, he once told her. Affectionate only on your terms. She'd laughed, wrapped her arms around him, and said, that's because I trust you not to cage me. But lately, it felt less like freedom and more like being tested, like he was always walking barefoot across glass, unsure which step would make her bleed. She never yelled, never slammed doors. Her weapon of choice was withdrawal. There were days when he'd come home from grocery shopping to find candles lit, jazz playing, dinner warm on the stove. She'd kiss him like she was relieved he came back. And then, out of nowhere, she'd turn. No tears, no fights, just distance. He used to ask her what was wrong. He used to chase her silence with questions like a detective desperate to solve a case with no body, no clues, just a deep sense that something had gone missing. But she always met his concern with a shrug. I'm just tired. Nothing's wrong. Stop overanalyzing everything. So he stopped asking. Instead, he started logging the patterns like an invisible journal in his head. How she'd go cold after he mentioned money. How her affection spiked when he booked them weekend getaways. How every time he brought up bills or splitting rent, her touch grew colder than the tile under his feet. Talia hadn't worked in almost a year. She used to freelance as a photographer, moody portraits and black and white street shots that Jake genuinely admired. But then she lost the spark. Said capitalism ruined art. Said she needed space to rediscover herself. So Jake picked up the slack. Rent, groceries, Netflix, Uber rides, her Spotify premium, the meditation app she never used but insisted was crucial to her healing. He didn't mind, at first. He loved her. Supporting her felt natural. But somewhere along the line, the support stopped feeling romantic and started feeling transactional. Jake once joked about canceling one of the apps she rarely used. Just light teasing. Her smile dropped like a guillotine. Wow, she said. Didn't know love came with a receipt. That was the first time he realized he might be paying for more than just subscriptions. Still, he stayed. And every time she faded out, he tried to pull her back. Not because he didn't see the red flags, but because he thought love meant patience, meant endurance, meant waiting out the storm even when the forecast never changed. She switched between lover and ghost without warning, Jake would later say. And I kept chasing both. That Tuesday morning, after she turned away, he didn't follow her. He just stood there, holding 2 mugs of coffee, one slowly cooling in his hand, the other untouched and unwanted on the counter. The fog outside had thickened, swallowing the skyline. And in that moment, Jake realized something quietly devastating. He wasn't living with a partner. He was living with a feeling that kept leaving. But over time, things started to change. The financial imbalance wasn't just about money anymore. It was about expectations. She didn't ask him to cover her costs. She never once mentioned the growing weight of the bills. But she didn't stop spending either. It was as though she assumed that, in their relationship, he would always be the one to handle the financial side. She was the artist, the dreamer, the one who got lost in books and late-night movies. He was the one who made it all happen. It became a subtle, unspoken agreement. He paid for everything, and she didn't question it. Until one night, when the tension between them was finally too much to ignore. They were sitting at their kitchen table, Jake sketching something on his tablet, Talia staring at her phone with a blank expression when he casually mentioned the possibility of sharing some costs. Maybe, he suggested, they could both contribute more equally. The rent, the subscriptions, the things they both used. He was fine with it, but it would be nice if they could share the load. Talia's response was immediate, cutting through the calm like a blade. "So you think love is transactional now?" she said, her voice low and cold, but tinged with something sharp, something accusing. Jake froze. He hadn't expected that. He had simply made a suggestion, nothing more. But her reaction was visceral. There was something in the way she said it that stung, like he had crossed some invisible line that neither of them had been aware of until that moment. He didn't argue. He didn't fight it. Instead, he just let it go. There was no point in pushing her further. She had already built her walls, and he wasn't sure if he could break through them anymore. But something inside Jake shifted that day. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't a moment of clarity, but more like the subtle, creeping realization that he had been living in a dynamic that no longer felt healthy. Love was not a transaction, but their relationship had become one, whether he liked it or not. He didn't announce it. He didn't confront her. But in the silence that followed, Jake started to make small, calculated changes. He opened a separate bank account, not because he didn't trust her, but because he needed something that was his, something that wasn't always just about the give and take of everything they shared. And then he stopped paying for the little things, the small, seemingly insignificant costs that had, over time, become the lifeblood of their daily routine. The HBO Max subscription, the one she'd used religiously to watch her favorite shows in the evenings. She hadn't even noticed when he stopped paying for it. She was too absorbed in her own world. So he let it go. ClassPass was next. She hadn't used it in months, but it still came out of his account automatically. He paused the subscription. He didn't need to explain it to her. She didn't seem to care, or at least, she didn't ask about it. And then, the hardest part, he stopped buying her favorite breakfast. The croissants. The ones she loved so much, always warm and flaky from the bakery around the corner. The ones she'd demand he bring home every Saturday morning. They had become a ritual, one of the few things in their relationship that felt special. But one morning, as Jake stood in front of the bakery, his hand hovering over the glass counter, he realized he couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep buying things for her when the emotional investment wasn't there anymore. "I stopped paying for things I wasn't emotionally subscribed to anymore," he would later think to himself. The silence between them grew. Talia didn't ask why the croissants stopped coming. She didn't question the lack of new shows on HBO Max. But Jake could feel the change in the air. It was palpable. She started to notice the small shifts, the withdrawal, but she didn't acknowledge them. She didn't have to. The gap between them had already widened too much for her to understand what was happening. Jake wasn't trying to punish her. He wasn't even trying to punish himself. But he couldn't continue living in a relationship where he was always the one giving, the one supporting, the one carrying the weight of everything. Because no matter how much he loved her, he realized that he couldn't keep loving her this way, without some reciprocity, without a balance, without feeling like he wasn't just a bank account with arms and a heart. In the end, it wasn't about the money. It was about the emotional currency. And Jake had realized that, for the first time in a long while, he was bankrupt. It was a quiet evening, the kind where everything felt slightly off, but no one was willing to address it. Jake was in the kitchen, rinsing his coffee mug from earlier, while Talia sat on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through her phone. The glow from the screen illuminated her face, but it didn't seem to light her up in the way it once did. Jake noticed the way she held the phone, her eyes not really reading anything, just passing time in a way that felt sad and almost mechanical. Then, the silence was broken, shattered, really, by the sudden shrill of her voice. "What the hell?" she snapped, furiously tapping her phone. "Jake, why is Netflix canceled?" Jake didn't flinch. He wasn't surprised. He had been waiting for this moment, the inevitable eruption that would come sooner or later, like the first crack in a dam. He put the mug down, took a slow breath, and poured himself a glass of water. The sound of the glass filling with water filled the space between them, loud and unforgiving. "I didn't want to pay for it anymore," he said quietly, without turning around. Talia's eyes widened, a mixture of disbelief and anger flashing across her face. "Are you seriously weaponizing streaming now?" she shot back, her voice sharp, cutting through the stillness. "We're talking about Netflix, Jake. What's next?" You gonna start charging me for Wi-Fi too? Or better yet, make me pay for the air we breathe? Jake's back remained to her. The words hit him like bullets, but he didn't flinch. He didn't feel like defending himself anymore. There was no point in defending the inevitable. He had been giving. She had been taking. And now he had stopped. He just wasn't going to feed the beast anymore. I don't need to explain myself, he muttered, the glass of water now resting in his hand. He took a sip, the coldness a stark contrast to the rising tension in the room. But that wasn't enough for her. No, Talia wasn't going to let this go. She was the kind of person who needed things to be seen and heard, validated in her anger, in her frustration. And this was it. This was the line that broke. "You're emotionally abusive," she screamed, rising from the couch, her voice thick with fury. "How dare you? How could you just take away something like that, something so small, so insignificant, just to prove a point?" Jake didn't even blink. He didn't respond. He couldn't. There was no response left inside him. Her words didn't land like they used to. They didn't sting. They didn't hurt. They were just words, empty and meaningless in the face of everything he had already put up with. He finished his water, the glass now empty, and slowly placed it down on the counter with deliberate calmness. Talia was pacing in front of him, her hands flailing around in the air, but Jake was already somewhere else. Somewhere distant. Somewhere that wasn't here. "I'm not abusive," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. He didn't raise it. He didn't shout. There was no emotion in his voice now. Just a flatness, a tiredness. "No, I'm just done funding a fantasy." The words hung in the air between them, an anchor in the stillness of the room. Talia froze, her hands stilled in midair. She stared at him, her mouth open, as if the words had slapped her across the face, hard enough to knock the wind out of her. She opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. The weight of his statement landed with an almost crushing force. For the first time in their relationship, Talia had no words to fight back with. No comeback, no quick retort, no sharp defense. There was only a silence that stretched between them, thick with the gravity of what had just been said. Jake didn't look at her. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. He was just done. He had put up with it for far too long. Her slow withdrawal, her refusal to contribute, her silent expectations that he would always carry the weight. But he was done. No more giving. No more pretending that everything was fine, that their love was still alive, when it had become a mere transaction. He didn't need to explain himself any further. He didn't need to validate his feelings anymore. His actions had spoken louder than any words could. Talia's face twisted in confusion, then anger, then something else, something more fragile, almost broken. "You think I'm just a fantasy?" she asked, her voice softer now, a tremor of hurt beneath the anger. Jake finally turned around to face her, his eyes steady but empty. He saw her standing there, eyes wide, vulnerable in a way she hadn't been in a long time. But it didn't move him. Not anymore. "No," he replied, his voice calm but resolute. "I think you're a dream I once had, and it's time I woke up." And with that, he walked out of the room, leaving her standing there in the silence. Talia didn't follow. She didn't call his name. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there, caught in the silence of the words he had left behind, wondering if she had ever truly understood who he was, and if he had ever really understood her. For Jake, it was the end of a chapter. And though the pain was there, buried beneath the finality of his decision, there was also a strange sense of relief. No more pretending. No more playing a part. He was free. Jake didn't flinch when the door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the apartment, a sharp punctuation mark to the end of a chapter he'd been dreading but almost expecting. Talia's footsteps were heavy as she stormed out, but Jake didn't move to stop her. He didn't rush to check his phone for messages, didn't try to reason, didn't beg for her to come back. He just waited for the silence that would follow. Talia had been unpredictable, like the weather, always shifting between storms and sunshine. For the last few months, the storms had been getting more frequent, more intense, and Jake was starting to realize he'd been bracing for impact far too long. Her tantrums, her icy silences, her manipulations, all of it had slowly chipped away at him, and now, standing in the wreckage of their relationship, he found something he hadn't expected: peace. He sat in the living room, the one they had shared, and let the silence settle around him. Then, he got up and started picking up the pieces of the life they'd tried to build together. Her things were everywhere. A stray book here, her favorite blanket draped carelessly over the back of the couch, an abandoned necklace tangled in the corner of the coffee table. Everything was a reminder of her, a fragment of the life they'd woven together over the past 3 years. With each item he picked up, he felt something release. The book she'd left behind, the perfume she wore, the plush slippers by the door. All these things seemed so small, but they were filled with memories. Some good, some bad, but all of them wrapped up in the story of who they had been together. It wasn't just physical things he was packing away. The real baggage was far heavier than anything he could fit in a box. Talia had always been someone who demanded constant attention, constant validation, and for a while, Jake had willingly given it. He thought it was love. But love, he was starting to realize, wasn't supposed to feel like a battlefield. Love wasn't supposed to feel like a constant negotiation, an endless back and forth where every move you made was calculated for the sole purpose of not being wrong. That wasn't love, that was survival. And now, as he picked up her things, he felt himself shedding years of compromises, of silence, of pretending that things would eventually get better. He hadn't been living, he'd been enduring. And what was worse, he had let her make him believe that was enough. He hadn't even noticed how much of himself he'd given away until there was nothing left to give. It was almost ironic, in a way. The more he packed away, the lighter he felt. It wasn't sadness or anger that he felt as he put her things into boxes. It was a strange kind of liberation. Maybe it was the finality of it all, this tangible evidence that he was finally cutting ties, not just with her, but with the version of himself he'd allowed to exist while he was with her. The version who was too afraid to leave, too afraid to rock the boat, too afraid to admit that he was no longer happy. As he packed the last of her things, some jewelry, her favorite hoodie, a half-empty bottle of her perfume, he closed the box and sat back on the couch. He ran his fingers over the edges of the cardboard, feeling the weight of it. Turns out, you can pack up 3 years in one box, he thought, the words feeling bittersweet in his mind. That's both sad and liberating. He looked around the apartment. It was quieter now. The loudest sound was his own breathing, and it felt like a small victory. He didn't feel the need to call her, didn't feel the urge to beg for a resolution. He had given up on that a long time ago. Talia had taught him that love wasn't about saving someone, and it wasn't about fixing things that were never meant to be fixed. It was about respecting yourself enough to let go when it was time. Jake didn't know what would come next. He didn't know how long it would take for the space she left behind to stop feeling so vast. But he knew he would be okay. The emptiness wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new, something he was finally ready to discover. As the apartment settled into a strange, new quiet, Jake knew one thing for certain. He would never again allow himself to lose who he was in a relationship. This time, when the door slammed, it wasn't just the end of a chapter, it was the end of a whole story, one he was ready to leave behind for good. 2 weeks later, Talia called. She wanted to meet, a quiet request through the crackling voice on the other end of the phone. Jake had no intention of seeing her, not really, but he agreed. They set the date at a little cafe in the heart of Seattle, the kind of place that smelled of roasted coffee beans and baked pastries, where everyone pretended to be busy even though it was really just a quiet backdrop to lost time. The day arrived. He saw her before she saw him. She entered the cafe, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow down. She was wearing that white dress, an old one, the one he had always liked, the one that made her look almost ethereal, the one that had once caught his eye 3 years ago. Her hair was swept up into the same style she wore when they first started dating, a messy bun with strands falling loosely around her face. The perfume she wore was the same, a scent that had once filled the air with warmth, but now, it was just an odor of nostalgia that clung to the air. She caught sight of him and smiled, though it was tight, almost like it was something she had to force out of herself. Talia had never been good at hiding her emotions, but now, it was different. Her smile was a mask. He knew that smile. It was the one she wore when she was about to try and convince him that things weren't really over, that there was still something worth salvaging between them. Jake didn't stand up, didn't wave. He just watched her walk toward him, noticing how her steps seemed a little slower than they used to be, as though she wasn't sure if she was walking toward a new beginning or a final goodbye. When she sat down, he didn't say anything. No greeting. No pleasantries. Just a quiet acknowledgement of the fact that they were both here now. That was enough. Talia, on the other hand, started immediately. Jake, she said, her voice soft but full of emotion, we need to talk. I know you're angry, but… I'm not angry, he interrupted. The words came out calm, maybe too calm for her taste. I'm just done. Her eyes widened slightly, disbelief flashing through them. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the table. Done? She asked, almost in a whisper. What does that mean? You know exactly what it means, Jake said, his voice low. You've been gone for a while now, Talia. Long before you actually left. She blinked, the realization creeping over her face. So that's how it is now? You're just going to walk away without a fight. Her voice was rising, the edge of anger creeping back in. You think this is all my fault? Jake didn't flinch. He didn't shout back. He didn't even apologize. He just stared at her, meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her squirm. I'm not fighting anymore, he said quietly. I stopped fighting a long time ago. This thing between us. It hasn't been real for a while. And I don't need to fight for something that isn't real. Talia's face twisted in something close to hurt, but Jake didn't react. He was done reacting to her emotions, to the drama, to the games. He had spent too long playing the part of the understanding boyfriend, the one who gave in, who forgave her time and time again. But not this time. Not anymore. I was the one who made all the compromises, she said, her voice growing desperate. I was the one who stayed home, who put everything on hold for us. You don't get to just throw that away. Jake let out a soft laugh, almost a chuckle. You didn't stay home for us, Talia. You stayed home for you. You stayed home because you didn't have the guts to chase what you really wanted. I was the one who had to make all the sacrifices, not you. I paid for everything. And when I asked you to contribute, you made it about love, about control. He shook his head. This was never about love. It was about convenience for you. It was always about you. But not anymore. Her face turned a shade of red, and her eyes welled with tears. I love you, she said, her voice breaking. I'm sorry. Please. Jake didn't let her finish. He pulled out an envelope from his bag and slid it across the table. Here, he said flatly. This is the end. It's a simple separation agreement. No hard feelings. No arguing. No drama. You get what's yours, and I get what's mine. It's fair. It's done. Talia's eyes shifted from the envelope to Jake, her lips trembling. You're just going to walk away from all of this? From us? You're just going to let it go like it's nothing? I'm letting it go because it is nothing, Jake said. His voice was steady, but his heart felt as though it had cracked in half. He had wanted to believe in the fantasy, in the idea that they could make it work, that love would be enough. But he had learned the hard way that love wasn't enough when it wasn't being shared equally, when it was only one-sided. And now, he was done pretending that things could go back to what they once were. Talia opened the envelope, her fingers trembling. As she scanned the document, her face fell, and she looked up at him, defeated. There were no arguments, no loopholes, no attempts at negotiation. There was nothing left to say. Jake stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. I'm sorry, he said, though his voice didn't carry the weight of guilt. But I'm not sorry enough to keep playing this game. And with that, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Talia sitting there, alone, with nothing but the echo of his words lingering in the air. For the first time in 3 years, Jake felt a sense of relief, a sense of freedom that came from knowing he had finally taken control. Jake sat in the stillness of his apartment, the familiar emptiness filling the space that had once been filled with laughter and moments of tension. The silence was different now. It was no longer suffocating, just peaceful. He had come home to a place that no longer felt like a battleground, a home that was no longer shared. The walls, once echoing with conversations and misunderstandings, were now his own, reflecting only his own thoughts. Tonight, he made dinner for one. There was no one else to ask about what to cook or where to eat. He reached for the ingredients, chopping vegetables with a calmness that had eluded him for months. The kitchen was simple, a reminder of how small moments he had often overlooked, were actually the ones that mattered. He didn't need to consult anyone about what music to play, nor did he have to check who had access to the Spotify account. He opened the app, scrolling through his playlists with the quiet hum of his own decisions. It was liberating. No more navigating the moods or preferences of someone else. No more adjusting his choices to fit into the rhythm of someone else's needs. Tonight, the music was his. The playlist filled the room, a mix of soft indie rock and the occasional classical piece, exactly what he needed. Then, as he sat down at the small table by the window, a notification flashed on his phone. He opened his email and saw the simple message. You've successfully unsubscribed from Talia's shared calendar. Jake froze for a moment. He hadn't realized how much that little detail, that calendar shared between them, had become a subtle weight on his shoulders. It wasn't just about appointments or plans anymore. It was a thread that had connected them, even when they were at their most distant. And now, with the swipe of a button, it was gone. A small laugh escaped his lips. There was something profoundly simple about the act, a quiet and final severing of a bond that had been strained for so long. He smiled, a mix of relief and something softer, acceptance. Some goodbyes didn't need grand gestures or explanations. They didn't need to be wrapped up with a neat, emotional bow. They just needed clarity. Jake leaned back in his chair, savoring the quiet that now enveloped him. The world outside was bustling with life, but inside, he felt lighter. The tension he had carried for so long, the uncertainty, the worry about what would happen next, had finally started to dissipate. He didn't need closure, he realized. He just needed this, the space to breathe, to rebuild. And for the first time in a long while, Jake felt the weight of his past dissolve into something new, something he could carry on his own. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and then opened them to the apartment that was his again. It was his time now,